We have had an insane amount of DLC for EU4, leading to situations where huge amounts of countries get extensive mission trees and loads of unique content. Countries like France, Austria, and England at this point have had multiple DLCs giving them missions, and in fact France at this point had a default mission tree for no DLCs, the French Emperor DLC missions, which gave France upgraded missions on top of that, and the French Domination missions, which again just went on top of all of those before. So clearly if France is getting 3 DLCs worth of mission updates, that means the rest of EU4 is pretty filled out, right? Well, honestly, for the most part, yes. Even tags like Hiss and Kaifa, which are not exactly popular outside of challenge runs or achievement runs, have missions now. So overall, the coverage is pretty good, with some exceptions. And before we get into those, I do have to ask for the usual things. A like on the video would be appreciated if you haven't already, and a subscription would be amazing. The gap between me and Playmaker is closing, and I would like to keep that going. The man has even preemptively learned how to trade, so clearly the fate of our victory is inevitable. So go down below and subscribe to secure it. With that self-shitting out of the way though, let's get an important distinction out of the way. To qualify as a neglected area for EU4, you need a couple things. You need to have done something historically cool or had some impact on the overall history of the planet, and people need to actually play your nation. And the reason I mention all of this is because, of course, there are neglected parts of EU4 that, let's be honest, if they stay neglected, nothing too major happens. For example, the Siberian Tribes. In terms of unique content, they have access to the Siberian Idea Group, which is shared between the Siberian Tribes. Not exactly the greatest ideas on the planet, but hey, at least they have some monthly war exhaustion reductions and some attrition for enemies and even some global settlers. However, they also have no missions, not really anything unique in terms of their government, a Siberian Native Council, which makes it very stable for some reason, and frankly, that's about it. In terms of content, these guys have nothing really going for them, and on top of it all, their entire playstyle is just kind of broken and no one's bothered to fix it, because I'll be honest, these guys have a play rate of -2% with a 2% margin of error. However, these countries don't really tend to get played, so saying that they are particularly neglected is, while accurate, not really helpful. What about the countries that actually have people playing them that are quite neglected? The first group of nations that I think are neglected but quite popular are going to be the Celtic group of nations. The nations in this group are going to be Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. In terms of content available for them, there's actually kind of some. All the Irish miners have access to a United Irish, mission tree, which is, to call this extensive is an insult at this point, but hey, it's at least something. And all of the Irish do have their own, at least, unique idea sets, at which point they can go ahead and unite Ireland and get a pretty decent Irish idea set, which England sometimes even takes as opposed to the normal English ideas if they want to be fighting more on the continent in multiplayer. They do also have access to a relatively unique Tanistry government reform, which gives them some bonus to morale damage, and eventually the High Island government reform when they form Ireland, which again has a little bit of unique flavour, but is severely lacking for, the amount of potential and the amount of people actually playing Ireland. And the same thing can be said for Scotland. They do have a Scottish monarchy government reform, which gives them parliament early, in the same way that the English have access to parliament early. However, their mission tree is, at this point, frankly disappointing, being a bit bigger than the Irish one, but not anything too specific. Their ideas are also unique, but nothing too special there in terms of content, and again, we're really lacking in terms of flavour and potential for this nation. In essence, one of the major problems of playing Scotland is your best game plan is basically just forming GB as Scotland, at which point you don't really retain any unique bonuses from doing it as Scotland, and you just end up playing a weaker England campaign. Wales can be somewhat excused, considering the fact they don't even start in 1444, but at least they have some cores on the provinces, and a, culture group. But really that's about it. With default ideas, a mission tree, and no real unique government reform, they don't have anything going for them, and the same can be said about Cornwall. Finally we get to Brittany, which nominally has unique missions, namely the Brest dockyards and to dominate the Atlantic trade mission line, as well as the line on the left about reconquering Normandy and expanding up the Loire. However, let's be honest, all you get out of it is some improved relations and a yearly prestige, at which point you can go ahead and form France with this small bonus. I mean, it's not a bad thing, 50% improved relations isn't awful, but not really worth starting as Brittany instead of as France, for example. And again, you kind of just end up doing a France game or something similar instead, with very little bonuses towards being, Brittany. You could also attempt us to do a colonial game with Brittany, and this is a relatively popular option. However, you struggle even more with trade for getting colonial trade into Bordeaux, as well as just in general not being a good colonizer compared to something such as Portugal. Overall, a very lacking mission tree, a relatively disappointing set of ideas, especially to top it off, and no unique governments or anything of that nature as well. And the reason I mention this as part of this entire Celtic group is this can be relatively decent seeming to do for a much needed update. Ireland, for example, could probably have some actual mission options for not just becoming a budget version of England and eventually, conquering the UK and just forming Britain. Similar things can be said for Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall. Some actual content for them would be nice, albeit more optional. And Brittany definitely could use a rework because it's a relatively big country in Europe that doesn't really have missions. Navarra, for example, is much smaller, but at least makes up for that with things like restorations of unions on France, meaning that if you are playing as a Navarra into Spain game, at least you get a France PU for your trouble. So for that reason, I hope you would agree with me that the Celtic areas is a pretty neglected part of the EU4 area, especially considering they're in Europe, so you'd have thought of the game of called Europa Universalis would have put an emphasis on European tags. But then we move on to Tunis, and in general the Barbary States around them. At this current point of this mission tree is just flat out disappointing and is incredibly sad, combined with very lackluster ideas for what they do, and a general Barbar Icta government reform. It does enable them to get Icta taxation and raid coasts, but beyond that it's not anything too unique, and this was basically their Band-Aid solution trying to give them some bonuses. Morocco's mission tree is a bit less disappointing, but could use a little refresh. Highlights still include, however, a permanent 2.5 discipline, which is normally why Morocco is formed as a 2.5 discipline to the end of the game bonus, if you are ever doing a modified stacking run. Outside of that, though, they are probably one of the more developed nations in this area. Same cannot be said for their subjects, who don't have access to any unique mission trees or any other tags in the area, like Clemenson, which has no missions and no real content, even default ideas, and a relatively normal government reform, or even tags like Jared, which aren't exactly picked unless you're trying to get the unlikely candidate achievement, but still could definitely use some content. Let's remember that historically, tags like Tunis and Morocco survived well into the 1700s, if not later, and again, historically, they would only actually start getting carved up by the time the Europeans were carving up Africa, and this was occurring outside of this time scope of the game, so these guys were around for quite a while. I think there's quite a lot of missed potential here with the amount of content they could have had. However, real disappointments have to go to the New World, and I'm not referring to natives, which actually have quite a decent amount of content at this point, and not that they're very much fun to play, they're still natives, but what I'm actually referring to are going to be the colonial nations, things like the USA, or even forming Texas, or even California, or things like Alaska, or even Mexico. Now, these nations are going to be appearing at the end of the game, so there's an argument to be made that, well, no one already plays late game EU4, so why add content for it? And another thing to add flames to the fire, as it were, is, well, these tags very rarely exist when they do. It's depressingly easy to hold on to colonial nations in this game, meaning that since Liberty Desire is never really a problem for your colonial nations, even the AI is kind of able to hold on to them, so they never ever really break free. I've seen Castile basically own the entirety of the New World, where they've been reduced down to just Sicily over in the Old World. So the fact that Liberty Desire is that easy to maintain means that even in games where unless the player is actively trying to get the USA or something to exist, they're not going to exist. This doesn't mean that people don't want to play them though. Exodus campaigns where you go to the New World and form something like Texas or California or the USA are incredibly common, especially for people that live in Texas or California or the USA and want to play as their nation, which makes sense. It is part of the fun of saying, oh, this is a province. I live here. I live in, I don't know, I don't know who lives in Prague, but there you go, you've been selected as an example now. I live in Prague, I own the province I live in, that's cool, right? And quite a few people play EU4 from America, and the fact that there's no real content for them is frankly quite disappointing. I feel like it could be genuinely quite a popular DLC, just adding a lot more content to mission trees, for example in Brazil for Argentina, adding like a Mexico mission tree, adding a big USA mission tree, for example. And more content for those tags, because what they have now is quite disappointing, and there's quite a lot they can do, especially with the revolutionary mechanics in the game, and a lot of other things that they can be built upon. A lot of potential there that just has not been worked on, in my opinion. Anyway, that is all I have time for today. A big thank you to all the people that supported me over at Ko-Fi, with a special thank you to Arkansas.